Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Carl Za joins us today for a wide-ranging discussion about colonial Hong Kong, the transition back to China, and the social and economic changes that developed. We analyze the current Hong Kong protests, the forces at work, and the prospects for a military crackdown or a peaceful resolution. Carl Za is an engineer, a historian, a podcaster, and a Caltech alum. His podcast, Silk and Steel, is about China, the US-China great power competition, and the history of empires, past and present. We recorded this on August 15th, 2019. Carl Za is here on the show with us, talking to us from Bali. Hi, Carl. Thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to meet you.
Hi, Joanne. Great to meet you, too.
So Carl is in Bali and he's been surfing, and I'm really jealous. Since I think most of our listeners are probably going to know you already, but why don't you tell us a little bit, maybe take a few minutes to tell us about yourself before we get started on the Hong Kong protests.
Sure. I am Carl Za. I'm a software engineering by training, and I also run my own podcast called the Silk and Steel podcast, which focus primarily on China, with a special focus on Chinese history, culture, current events, politics, basically everything China related I will talk about, and I love to talk. So thank you again for inviting me to the show, Joanne, because I have been a long-term fan of your show. It's really an honor to be finally on this show that I have been listening for so long. So recently I decided to travel a bit in East Asia. I've been in China for a couple months, and now I'm in Bali, Indonesia, because I love surfing. This place is great for surf. I'm basically living a tropical paradise right now, so I can't complain. And I'm actually going to try to see if I can just live out here. I have a little bit savings, so I quit my job and I leased a house in Bali for 1 year. And right now I'm just trying to see if I can grow my Patreon following so that will enable me to stay in Bali forever.
I hope so. That would be fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah, my brother's a surfer, so I get that lifestyle. Well, I mean, he's a business guy, but he surfs every minute that he can, and he's also out on his Hobie Cat sailboat all the time too.
Nice.
So I live kind of close to the coast as well. But excuse me?
Are you in California?
No, I'm in New Jersey. A lot different, but
the water must be cold. Well, actually, might not be too bad right now. It's August, right? It must be warm.
It's very warm. Yeah, it's cold in June, but in July and August and September, even into October, the water's pretty warm. So, wow. And you can wear a wetsuit, so you can stretch it.
I mean, we in SoCal, we always have to wear a wetsuit, except like 2 weeks in August. I mean, like if we're lucky, like 1 month. So that's why I love Bali right now. Like every day, I don't need a wetsuit. I just literally grab my board and jump in, and it feels so nice.
Yeah. I was surprised at how cold the water was when I was in California. The ocean was freezing cold.
Yes, we got that cold current coming all the way down from Alaska that goes all the way to, I think, Cabo, Mexico. So yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I encourage people to also, I've been looking forward to talking to you. We've been in touch for a long time, probably a year. I think I first heard of you on the Warner
Yes.
podcast. I'm a big fan of that. And then I got in touch with, I got connected with your podcast and on
Yep.
Discord and things like that. So I'm glad that we finally did get a chance to do this. And,
Yes.
I was really looking forward to talking to somebody who had some perspective on the Hong Kong protests, because as you know, if you're still keeping track of Western media,
Yes.
we're getting an interesting perspective here. And Carl, I I'd say up till about 5 years ago, maybe, by default, I would be in favor of protesters if they were, looking for more justice, more
Yes.
freedom, or things like that. And so
Yes.
by default, even if I didn't know that much about their culture or their country or the political situation, I would tend to side with them by
Yes.
default. But
Yes.
I learned a lot of lessons. I
Yes.
learned some lessons first with Ukraine. Um,
Yes.
it took me a while to figure out what was going on, but once I did, I was like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, I still do sympathize with the common people, right? I mean, I'm always on the
Mhm.
side of just the people.
Yeah.
Uh, and then when the same thing happened in Syria, it's like,
Yes.
oh, okay, yeah, this is not the way it's being portrayed. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yep.
And so I'm a lot more cautious now.
Hmm.
And I sort of get the whole color revolution thing. And even if it's not a color revolution, I get that different countries will side with their dissidents, right?
Yep.
Just to, um, just to undermine each other and, or,
Yes.
even just as a propaganda tool. So with the Hong Kong protests, I was a lot more leery about what was going on. Again, you know, I, I want these people to have a good life. I want them
Yes.
to have freedom of speech. I don't want them to live in a police state, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Same thing we want for our own people, right?
Right.
So, um, but I've been to Hong Kong actually. I spent a couple of weeks in Hong Kong.
It's a beautiful city. I
It's
I
really
only.
yeah, it's a wonderful place. And now this is some decades ago, right? This is was early in my career, and I went over there to. I actually worked out in the New Territories. I
Oh,
stayed.
really? That's
I
like in the
did.
boondocks.
Oh, it was really in the boondocks. Yeah, I mean, it was urban, but it was very, they were still really struggling. It was a very
Yeah.
poor area. And this is before the handover. This
Hmm.
is during the transition period. So it was still technically whatever
Was still
range, but
British.
yeah,
British colony. Yeah.
it was still British, but the Chinese had already really started to get much more involved. Like the hotel I stayed in was actually owned by the Chinese. It was on Hong Kong Island, and then
Mm.
I used to take the metro all the
Yes.
way out to the New Territories, which was close to the land border with
Yep.
China. And it was I mean, the people were wonderful.
Yep.
It was an American company, right? So I was setting up some IT in a warehouse out in the New Territory. So I was there for a couple of weeks. I really got the sense of it. It's very easy for an American to make your way around in Hong Kong because at the time everything was in Chinese and English, so you could,
Yes.
yeah. So and the people were wonderful, and the people I worked with, we were employees of the same company, and they were just really wonderful. This guy Harvey, they adopt an English name in addition to their Chinese name,
Yep.
and he insisted on taking me around to the, showing me around to these night markets and things like that, and out to restaurants where only the natives ate, and
Yes.
I really enjoyed myself and I appreciated it. And the population, one thing that I notice is they're very sophisticated. I mean, they
Yes.
speak numerous languages. They're
Yep.
very, very cosmopolitan,
Yes.
and So anyway, I feel like I have, things no doubt have changed in a couple of decades, but I'm sure that the sense of it is hasn't that the culture is probably still similar. So
Yeah,
I feel like I do know a little bit about how things are there.
yeah,
So I would, and it was very peaceful. I didn't notice any unrest. I didn't
yeah,
notice any heavy police presence or anything like that.
yeah.
So when I see these things on TV, I'm like, wow, what's going on here? And I guess last week there was a scare because there was a video going around with military troop carriers, long lines of them,
Oh,
and
it's actually just happening today too. Today, Twitter was going crazy of all these videos of Chinese military vehicles amassing on the across the border from Hong Kong in the Chinese city of Shenzhen. Like
mm.
it's all like even Donald Trump tweeted retweeted that. He retweeted Sean Hannity retweeting that same video.
So is that for Rio? The last time nothing came of it. There were these sort of ominous tweets about something very bad is going to
Yeah.
happen. And also, I saw a speech. I happened to catch it on Periscope. The UK, sorry, the Chinese ambassador to the UK
Yeah.
giving a speech.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I listened to some of that. So I got a sense of, how they're not happy at all. It was
Yeah.
kind of a rant, right? It
Yeah.
was, and there was a lot of sarcasm in it, a lot of bitterness, let's say.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
basically, the Chinese ambassador just tell the world to fuck off.
yeah,
Yeah, sorry,
pretty
can't say that
much.
word on the
Yeah,
show.
yeah, no problem.
And he just basically said this is Hong Kong is part of China and it's none of your business to interfere in our internal affairs, basically.
Right, yeah. So anyway, just giving that intro of who we are and what we know and what our
Right.
perspective is. Where's a good place to start with this? Should we talk about the transition? Should we?
Yeah, I think it is. Maybe just I can just give a little brief background of Hong Kong and what is kind of given what kind of drives the protest and some of the rationale and the discontent that's behind it. Um, because as most people probably already know, British received Hong Kong from China. Well, not really receive, but really just grab Hong Kong from China as a result of First Opium War, and and then us, but then you already talk about new territory. So Hong Kong is actually there was three parts. The Hong Kong island was ceded to Britain after the First Opium War, and then after the Second Opium War, British got another piece of territory. That's a Kwai Long Peninsula, and then after 1895, after the first Sino-Japanese War, when Japan defeated China, that's when all the imperialist power realized that China is really weak. So they all moved in to do another round of carving up. That's when British forced China to sign a lease on the new territory. That's the largest piece of land in Hong Kong that's but jutting off the mainland. And the lease was supposed to expire in 1997, right after 99 years. So in the 1980s, when Thatcher was prime minister of Britain, she started negotiation with China, and originally she wanted to renew the lease. Right after 1997, Thatcher still wanted to keep Hong Kong and maybe renew it for another 99 years. And Deng Xiaoping, who was then the spring leader of China, said no, not going to happen. And Thatcher then went to his military brass and asked them to draft a plan, a contingency plan for defending Hong Kong from the mainland takeover. And at that point, the military brass had to set her down and basically tell her, no, that's impossible. And because Hong Kong depends everything on mainland, like Hong Kong is not self-sufficient in water. Hong Kong actually depends on mainland to deliver its water. Yes, a big water project was actually constructed in 1960s for China to supply water to Hong Kong. And one of the reasons that the communist China didn't simply take over Hong Kong when they totally could is because after 1949, after the communists come to power in China, there was basically a Western blockade on Chinese mainland. So the only place that China could do business with the outside world was through the British colony of Hong Kong. And that is why China didn't simply do like what India did in Goa, just move troops in and take over. And that's another reason why Hong Kong was able to take off economically, because prior to 1949, Hong Kong was a relative economic backwater compared to city like Shanghai, because Shanghai was really the pearl of the Orient back then. But in 1949, as the communist troops were moving down to take over Shanghai, all the Shanghai capitalists and industrialists, they fled in mass to Hong Kong, taking with them their capital, their expertise, and at the same time, there was a massive refugee wave from mainland due to the Chinese Civil War. So that provided the cheap labor. And it's a combination of the capital flight from mainland, the mass refugee wave pouring into Hong Kong to provide the cheap labor, plus that Hong Kong was then the only window for mainland to the outside world. That really created the condition for Hong Kong to boom. So the Hong Kong's glory days, basically started from 1949 all the way, I say, up to the handover, 1997.
Yeah, that's when I was there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so even after, after Thatcher was forced to go back to negotiation table with Deng Xiaoping, in the end, she basically conceded there's no way Britain can keep Hong Kong, and the deal was at end of the lease, 99-year lease on new territory. Britain was going to hand over the whole thing to China, not just new territory, but also the Hong Kong island, Kowloon Long, everything, right? But as part of the deal, they created what's called the Sino-British Joint Declaration 1984, that China promised to keep the Hong Kong's existing capitalist system as is, right? There will be no change for 50 years until 2047. That was the deal. So this was called one country, two system. So Hong Kong will become part of China in 1997, but Hong Kong get to keep its separate system, the separate political institution, so everything separate, right? That was the deal. But under the British rule, right, Hong Kong didn't have democracy. They didn't have election. But after 1984, after the Sino-British Joint Declaration, then Britain decided to do limited democratic reform in Hong Kong, and that's when they introduced a limited elections. It's not one man, one vote. They set aside like a block of votes for their legislatures for, like, say, the business community, right? And like the doctors and the lawyers get some votes. And China was okay with that because something else happened in 1989, and that was the Tiananmen Square protest. And after the Tiananmen Square crackdown, China was basically isolated diplomatically. At the time, there were Western sanctions on China, and also the Hong Kong was pretty rattled by the crackdown, because at the time, most of the Hong Kong, just like most of the mainland, a lot of people's sympathy were with the student protesters. And so when the protest was crushed, there was almost kind of panic inside the territory of Hong Kong because they're facing the pending handover and they don't know what's going to happen to them. So to reassure people in Hong Kong, China agreed to keep the system, basically the British colonial structure as is, no change for 50 years. But something changed again in 1994 when the last British colonial governor, Chris Patten, was appointed. He decided he was going to expand the election rights just literally 3 years before the handover, right? And yes, at that point, that really irked China because China felt like they had an agreement with Britain. Everything was going to stay the same. The ink already just dry on the deal, and now they feel, Chris Patten was totally reneging on the deal, and it was a special time as well because this was 1993, 94. Soviet Union just collapsed. Communism just collapsed in Eastern Europe. So China at the time was one of the last man standing.
Yeah, not feeling very confident. Yeah.
Yes. So at the time, and also it was still kind of suffering under the Western sanction after the aftermath of Tiananmen. But at the time, it feels like there was a triumph of the Western liberal democracy worldwide. That's when Francis Fukuyama wrote the book, The End of History, right? And everybody kind of expected maybe China will go the way of Soviet.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, one of I used jokingly say America's #1 China expert, Gordon Chan. Yes, he was a lawyer, a tax lawyer then in Hong Kong, and he wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China. He published in 2001, and he had to revise that date every year ever since.
Yeah. And it's at some point, maybe later on after you finish this narrative, tell us about Gordon Chan because that he is a dominant voice here. So we're getting a lot of perspective from him. Yes. I don't know much about the guy, but maybe later on you can give us some insight on him.
He has a very interesting background story, and he's actually just a couple of days ago, he was on CNN talking about Hong Kong. And so during the 1990s, when China looks like the next domino to fall, Chris Patten decided, he's going to be the last colonial governor of Hong Kong. He was going to make a name for himself, leave a legacy, and he decided that legacy will be the electoral reform of Hong Kong. So he expanded the election rights. That really pissed off China. And after the election of 1995, that's after the broadening of the electoral base. It brought in many popular elected leaders, what's later now known as the pan-democratic camp. So China was not happy about that. And so right after the handover, 1997, China just decided to dismiss the legislative council that was elected in 1995 and replace it with a provincial council. And then in 1998, they had a new election, but based on the pre-1994 election reform laws. So all the British election laws, like in the early 90s. And so what we're talking about limited democracy, right? Like
they basically took voting rights away from people at that point.
Exactly. And that was the first bad blood between the Chinese government and the pan-democratic camp of on, because all these legislators who just got elected into office in 1995 basically got booted out 2 years later, right? And among the leader of the pan-democratic camp was Martin Lee. He is very, so ever since then, he worked very closely with the United States State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy. In fact, if you search NED and Martin Lee, you will find like a Martin Lee biography on the NED website. and and
Okay.
yeah, so for China's perspective, it got this legislature that was designed under the colonial system, basically composed entirely of the Hong Kong business elite oligarchs, right? Who, for their own self-interest, decide to bend the knee to China, right? And then on the other side is these rabble rousers, pan Democrats who are very close with Washington, right? For China, Chinese central government, it was a no-brainer. They were going to go with a business elite as oligarchs, and so what happened is after 1997, you have this business interest in Hong Kong entrench itself in the Hong Kong political system, and this had consequences for Hong Kong and the working class people of Hong Kong, because during the colonial days, British colonial days, it was pretty bad. There was a lot of racism, and it was basically not a democracy. Everything was made, decision was made by the colonial governor, but at least there was some kind of balance of power between the British colonial governor and the Hong Kong local business community, right? And one of the problems with Hong Kong is that the real estate price is insane, and people think, oh, that's normal because Hong Kong has such small piece of land, like with 7 million people, of course it's going to be expensive. But I know you have been to Hong Kong and you have been to new territory, so you know how much land, empty land, is out there in Hong Kong. And what Hong Kong government is doing is it's artificially inflating the land prices by only a very small amount of land for development each year, because the Hong Kong government derived most of its revenue from land sales to real estate developers. And if you look at the richest man in Hong Kong, right, among the top 10, a huge majority of them are all real estate developers. And these people now basically has the control of the Hong Kong Legislative Council and making decisions. So what ended up happening was that back then in the colonial days under British rule, the Hong Kong government was have a program to build 20 to 30K units, so 20 to 30,000 units of public housing for basically young families who are starting out, right? At like a subsidized price. After 1997, after the Hong Kong government was completely taken over by the local business interest, aka real estate developers, when the Chinese government, when the Beijing government decided to take a very hands-off approach, because one country, two system, one reason China also decided to take a very hands-off approach is because they didn't want to spoof all the capitalists of Hong Kong to do another capital flight, right? Like back then when they fled from Shanghai to Hong Kong in 1940. Right? And because I don't know if you remember, like just prior to the handover, a lot of Hong Kongers, middle class and upper middle class Hong Kongers, immigrated to Canada, right? Because Canada has these like investment immigration where if you invest certain amount, buy property, you can get green card. So a lot of Hong Kongers with some means, with some money, they go to Canada, they buy houses in Vancouver, right? So get a green card or a Canadian passport, and then they go back to Hong Kong to work, to make money. But just in case, they have the Canadian passport, they can run back to Canada. So it's
so they really weren't confident. It was unstable in their view.
Yes. So it was that kind of environment that the Chinese government have to reassure the business people in Hong Kong they're going to be totally hands off. But what that meant was the Hong Kong local real estate developers who dominated the business landscape, they also dominated the political structure. And so Hong Kong government went from building 20 to 30,000 public unit housing per year to building just 2,000 units per year. I mean, it was a drastic change. And I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the Hong Kong protesters that are on the street right now skewer to very, very young. It's mostly, people. There's a narrative that people say, oh, look, Hong Kongers are so unhappy with China that they rather go back to the harken back to the British colonial days. But in fact, the most people who are protesting right now, they're the youth who are born or grew up in Hong Kong after 1997. They never experienced British colonial rule, right? The only life they have known was Hong Kong after handover, and the life they have known in the Hong Kong after handover is the Hong Kong that was dominated by the Hong Kong business oligarchs who basically jacked them by raising the real estate price sky high, right? There was a collusion between the real estate developer and the Hong Kong government to keep the real estate housing prices high. There was a time when the first Hong Kong governor appointed by mainland China tried to do some sort of reform. He tried to build 85K unit of public housing instead, to expand the public housing program. But he had a very bad timing because around that time there was a rising real estate bubble was developing in Hong Kong prior to 1997, and then Hong Kong got hit with the I don't know if you remember the 1998 Asian financial crisis that hit Hong Kong really hard. And one consequence of that is the collapse of the real estate market. And so, the business people, the middle class people in Hong Kong got really hurt by the housing collapse. Many of people went bankrupt. So they were very opposed to the government suddenly expanding the housing program to even more to introduce more glut to the market, and the real estate developers of Hong Kong leveraged that public sentiment, got people on the street, staged a huge protest. They totally scrapped the new Hong Kong government program to build more public housing. So it's back to building only 2,000 units of public housing per year. And what you have is, Hong Kong have all these young people in Hong Kong. They're facing an economic future that's not very that's actually quite similar to the millennials face in the West because Hong Kong used to be a manufacturing hub, and then after China started opening up economically, all the Hong Kong capitalists moved their capital and their factories into China.
Okay, I see. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, whereas the labor is much cheaper. So all the manufacturing in Hong Kong got hollowed out, and instead, only thing Hong Kong left economically was financialization. Right, Hong Kong became a financial capital for all the investment that's seeking to pour into China. And the second backbone of Hong Kong industry is real estate. Right, just real estate and finance, and like this transition to the service economy from a previously a manufacturing economy is just going as well for the Hong Kong youth as it's going well for the millennial in US right now. And all these Hong Kong youth, they're facing with diminished economic prospect. They're facing with skyrocket housing prices. So their discontent is real. And on top of that, they know they don't have representation in their government, right? Their government is completely controlled by the oligarchs who are not exactly responsive to their needs. So
That's very interesting.
there's real discontent, real legitimate concerns, right? Real anger. But instead of focusing the issue on the real issue, which is the domination of the oligarch in all walks of life in Hong Kong, all this anger, discontent get redirected against the mainland Chinese.
How about that?
And because there's also a fundamental balance shift between Hong Kong and mainland, because back in the 1980s, I remember, because I lived in the mainland China in 1980s, for us, Hong Kong was this magical place where
Yeah, like that's what I'm very surprised about, because and the ambassador in the UK he said something like, just across the border in forgive me, is it
Shenzhen,
Shenzhen?
yeah, Shenzhen,
Shenzhen. He was saying that the people there basically have a better life and much more economic opportunity than
yes,
they do in Hong Kong, and
yeah,
that shocked me. I'm still not used to the new world.
yes,
Uh, so it was the opposite of what I knew, or the way I
yes,
thought things were.
yes.
So
Yes, because there's a couple of reasons for that. In 1980s, when China first opened up, Shenzhen was a fishing village. It was what Hong Kong was before British took it over. And what China did was they wanted to experiment with market capitalism. But they didn't want to do like a shock therapy like Russia style, and like just do one big thing and then watch what happens. So they decided to make Shenzhen the guinea pig. They made Shenzhen so-called the special economic zone because it's across the border from Hong Kong. And if the market reform goes bad, what happens in Shenzhen can stay in Shenzhen. So Shenzhen was giving very special, privileges in terms of, like administration and tax rules, and to attract Hong Kong capital to cross the border. So initially, all the manufacturing from Hong Kong went to Shenzhen. Factory got set up in Shenzhen because land was cheaper, labor was cheaper. You have like cheap labor from all over China going to Shenzhen to work in these export-oriented factories. But as time went on, Shenzhen was able to transition from purely manufacturing hub to a high-tech center.
yeah,
Like
that's what he
now,
said.
today, Shenzhen is equivalent to like the Silicon Valley of China. Shenzhen is a high-tech center of China. Like all Shenzhen has its own stock market. A lot of people in US today are probably familiar with commercial drone DJI, right?
Yeah.
The DJI is probably the most successful Chinese brand. They're based in Shenzhen, right? And it's a Chinese commercial drone company. They have like 75% of the world market or something like that. But there are a lot of startup company just like DJI that's based in Shenzhen, just because Shenzhen created that kind of the tech friendly environment. On top of that, it's also because Shenzhen drew talent from all over China. The population of 1.4 billion people, so they can get like engineers from top universities from all over China, from Beijing, from Shanghai, all over China. They all go to Shenzhen to work like for Huawei, right? Huawei is based in Shenzhen, right? Not
Oh,
all the
okay.
Americans know about Huawei, and so Shenzhen, it was like became a boomtown. But back in the 80s, it was very different. Back in the 80s, a Hong Kong taxi driver could walk across the border to Shenzhen, set himself up with a mistress or two, like very easily. Because back then, mainland was so desperately poor. Anybody who has a job in Hong Kong can go to Chinese mainland and live it up like kings. Kind of like how the American expat are, you know, living it up in Southeast Asia,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that kind of lifestyle. So in the eyes of Hong Kongers, mainland Chinese are like their very poor, backward country bumpkin cousins, right? But then in the new age, after the internet age, after the Shenzhen economically take off, now you have all these wealthy mainlanders coming to Hong Kong to shop for luxury goods because Hong Kong has low luxury tax compared to mainland. So luxury goods like Louis Vuitton, everything is cheaper in Hong Kong. So a lot of mainland shoppers, they go to Hong Kong to purchase luxury goods, and some of them come to Hong Kong to buy real estate property. So So now Hong Kongers facing with their own bleak economic future. They blame everything on the mainland Chinese coming into the territory. They're blaming mainland Chinese for buying real estate property, driving up the housing prices. They're blaming so there was a milk powder scandal in China in early 2000. There was a baby milk powder manufacturing. For that, they had some deadly chemicals in their baby milk formula, and that caused some deformities in some babies. It was a big scandal in China, and it totally destroyed reputation of all Chinese domestic baby milk dairy producers. So the Chinese consumers got spooked, and they turned to overseas to source their baby milk formulas. And a lot of Chinese mainland people do is they just hop across the border, go to Hong Kong and buy baby milk formula. So all these Hong Kong local residents are now complaining that all these mainlanders are coming over, buying up all the baby milk powders, leaving nothing for Hong Kong. I mean, basically everything got blamed. I mean, it's kind of I think you can do a somewhat analogy to United States, right? Like right now, we are still kind of suffering under the after effect of the Great Recession, even though economic numbers looks like rosy, but like the real working class people are still, still not that, didn't feel that the confidence in the future. So what people do is they blame immigrants, right? They blame Mexican immigrants, and the same thing happened in Hong Kong. These Hong Kong youth who are not happy, angry with their lots, they blame mainland Chinese people. Not even the Chinese government. They blame the mainland Chinese people for causing like misery in their lives. So there was a rise of very ugly nativism sentiments, particular anti-mainland Chinese nativism sentiment. And in fact, in 2014, like you said, when you were in Hong Kong, it was very peaceful, no protests, right? The first big scale kind of the public protest broke out in 2014. That was the big Occupy Hong Kong movement called the Umbrella movement. And
yes.
And the Umbrella movement was bankrolled by the Hong Kong media tycoon, Jimmy Lai, who is like a Rupert Murdoch figure because he owns Apple Daily, the biggest tabloid in circulation in Hong Kong. And he has some personal beef with the Chinese government because he supported he used to run basically a clothing shop and called Giordano. And because he supported the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989, the Chinese government blacklisted his company, Giordano. He was forced to sell all his shares in Giordano, and he took all the proceeds and started his media empire, the Apple Daily. And so the Apple Daily is well-known anti-mainland Chinese, anti-mainland Hong Kong newspaper. It's a tabloid that mostly focuses on celebrity gossip, but then you will put in some editorials attacking Beijing. So Jimmy Lai was always Beijing's public enemy number one, and he of course is not happy about impending Beijing takeover. So in 2014, he bankrolled the Umbrella movement, and at that time, a lot of the these Hong Kong nativists, they crowdfunded an ad in Apple Daily, the newspaper of Jimmy Lai. And it's a big poster. If you Google search Hong Kong locust ads, you will find it. It's a huge poster with image of like Hong Kong, but giant locusts descending on the city. And
oh my gosh.
Yes, and they're calling the mainland Chinese a locust. And specifically,
oh, I see it. Oh my gosh, it's like
yes.
doom and it's yellow, it's like fire, it's
yes.
yeah, very ominous, right?
Yes. And the what it says on the poster is Hong Kongers, aren't you tired of spending, I think, $1 million Hong Kong dollars every 18 minutes to have these pregnant locusts coming to Hong Kong to give this illegal child? Because at the time, as part of the handover to China, China agreed to keep all the laws of Hong Kong, including immigration laws. So mainland Chinese cannot freely travel to Hong Kong. They need a stamp on their passport to enter Hong Kong, even though Hong Kong is technically Chinese territory after 1997. And one of the old Hong Kong law was that you don't automatically gain Hong Kong resident permit even if you are born in Hong Kong. Right, and so the Hong Kong government wanted to keep that colonial, keep to that rule. But at the time, there's a lot of human rights activists in Hong Kong that raise the issue, saying, well, it's a human rights issue. Why are you denying people born in Hong Kong their citizenship? They stage a huge protest, and eventually the Hong Kong courts, because Hong Kong has a separation between their courts and their their administrative branch. So the Hong Kong Supreme Court reversed the decision and ruled that anybody who was born in Hong Kong is entitled to live in Hong Kong. And what happened then is, even when you were there, right, in the pre-handover days in 1990s, there was still a big difference between mainland and Hong Kong. So some mainland pregnant women would go to Hong Kong, deliver their babies, so their babies will have the Hong Kong papers, right? And same thing is happening in the United States now, right? Like Fox is talking about these anchor babies, right?
Yeah, same thing.
So exactly same thing was happening in Hong Kong. So a lot of these, so Apple Daily was running all these scare stories about all these Hong Kong, this mainland mothers coming to Hong Kong delivering anchor babies, totally using up the Hong Kong taxpayers' money to consume the medical resources of Hong Kong. That was what the ads was about. It was about all these mainland locusts coming to Hong Kong consuming.
I see.
Yes. So this, I mean, this was a very famous ad. Like the I think for most of the mainland Chinese people, they what happened to most of them are part apathetic. They don't really concern about what's really going on in Hong Kong, about whether Hong Kong people strive for their political rights or whatever, because it's very removed from their own life. But what they do understand is this anti-mainland sentiment, because it's directed against them, right? And that's why you get very little sympathies, either in 2014 or today, from the mainland Chinese for the Hong Kong protesters, because the Hong Kong protesters define themselves as, we're not the mainland Chinese. We are different. I mean, it's understandable to a certain extent, right? Because Hong Kong was a special administrative region. They did enjoy special political rights under the one country, two system. But the natives' sentiment took such an ugly turn, as you can see from that poster. And in fact, that they would, one of the things that happened in the protest, this recent protest, was that they stormed the building of the Chinese Central Government Liaison Office in Hong Kong. So this was the old China Xinhua News Agency's office in Hong Kong. That was kind of the unofficial Chinese embassy consulate in Hong Kong during the British colonial days. And after the handover, the central government turned the Xinhua News Agency office into the Central Government Hong Kong Liaison Office. That's kind of like the go-between the Hong Kong government and the central government. So that office was besieged by the Hong Kong protesters last week or a couple weeks ago, and they defaced the Chinese national emblem in the front. On top of that, they painted racial slurs used by Japanese during World War II against the Chinese. The painted Shina. Shina is an old term for China in Japanese. It used to be a neutral term. It just means China. But during World War II, during the second Sino-Japanese War, that term become highly derogatory. I mean, the Chinese find the term very offensive. Its English equivalent would be like chink, right? And
Okay.
yes, and but the Hong Kongers, in an effort to define themselves as not Chinese, they use this very derogatory term, Shina, chink, to describe the mainland Chinese. So they painted the word Shina on the office of the central government liaison office to Hong Kong. So instead of say the China liaison office, they painted the Shina liaison office of Hong Kong. I mean,
Okay.
yes, yes. So, but this kind of anti-mainland sentiment, this ugly nativism aspect of the Hong Kong protest was very rarely reported, if at all, in the Western mainstream media, because we just want to present a narrative of these brave Hong Kong people versus the authoritarian central government of China, right?
Yeah, yeah, with the looming military Tiananmen
Yes,
Square style
yes,
crackdown coming.
yes,
Yeah,
yes. Um,
very much so. And here the way what's being presented here is that the entire thing is about a law change, a change
yes.
that, was going to be able to extract
Yes.
criminals out
Yes.
of, yeah. So that's what it was all about.
Yeah.
That's,
It was
none of this
start.
background is given at all.
Yeah. It was started as the anti-extradition treaty. Because Hong Kong did not have a extradition treaty with mainland, and just like Canada or U.S. doesn't have extradition treaty with China, and so what ended up happening, this is especially in case of Canada, is a lot of the financial crooks in China after they got their commit their financial crimes and got their ill-gotten gain, they will go to Canada. And because Canada have this investment visa, right? You invest like $500,000, you get a green card. So they will invest themselves a Canadian green card. And because Canada doesn't have an extradition treaty with China, they're in Canada scot-free and living off their ill-gotten gains. And this has been going on for years. Um,
And this is the whole capital flight thing too, right?
yes, yes, yes,
We
and
saw something similar with Russia. So
yes, yes, and then and then what triggered this latest so there's a lot of history on this extradition treaty bill because back in the I think back in the 90s or 2000s there was a famous murder case in Hong Kong where a Hong Kong millionaire or billionaire, their family got kidnapped, and then the criminal, the triads who did the kidnapping, they fled to China, right? And because there's no extradition treaty between Hong Kong and China, they were arrested by the mainland Chinese authorities, and they were tried in the mainland Chinese courts and sentenced there. So at the time, the pan-democratic camp in Hong Kong said, oh my God, no, these Hong Kong citizens are now being subjected to arbitrary laws in PRC, right? We should really have we urged our Hong Kong government to have an extradition treaty with the central government so we can bring these Hong Kong citizens back to Hong Kong to persecute under our own laws. Okay, this was this was in 2000, but now their position totally changed.
now
Anyway,
it's the opposite.
yes,
Okay.
yes, but more recently, what triggered this new law is a very grisly murder case. There was a Taiwanese guy who brutally murdered his Hong Kong girlfriend, chopped her up, and it was just very bad case. And then he fled to Taiwan, and Taiwan and Hong Kong does not have a formal extradition treaty, right? And so one of the impetus for driver for this package extradition treaty done. It's a general extradition treaty, not just with mainland, but also with Taiwan. And so the driver was for that because that very well publicized case, trying to get that Taiwan murderers back to Hong Kong to face trial. But this is Hong Kong we're talking about. Like Hong Kong, just like Canada, it's a lot of the people who had financial misdealings in mainland. They run to Hong Kong, and a lot of the Hong Kong billionaire, Hong Kong oligarchs, they're also afraid that they will
That they'll
themselves.
get extradited. Yeah, yeah,
Yes. So recently, I think there was a report on, I forgot, it was Wall Street Journal, or they reported about these a bunch of Hong Kong billionaires now turning out against Hong Kong protests. But if you read about what they say, they actually says, oh, I think it was Peter Wu, his name. He's one of the, I think, one of eighth wealthiest man in Hong Kong. Like he's a billionaire, and he said in the beginning I wholeheartedly supported the anti-extradition treaty, right? But now, now with all the escalating violence, I regret it because now I'm losing $1 billion in my business. This is just reported kind of superficially, but what really happening is all these oligarchs who who had a stake into getting the extradition treaty repealed, right? And that's what they're concerned about. Now they're happy because the extradition treaty was actually suspended, right? It's
yeah.
probably not coming back. The extradition treaty is really dead, deader than dead. But the Hong Kong government is unwilling to say that they're completely withdrawn it, probably because for face-saving measures.
I see.
and but like for the business elite, they're fine now. Their concern is to get in the extradition treaty bill pulled. But the protest went on, right? Because right after, because before the extradition treaty was pulled, there was a large scale protest. It was widely reported about 2 million people on the street. Later, there was a retraction. It turns out they used satellite imaging. It was reported, I forgot, it was in Reuters or South China Morning Post, that after the image analysis, they realized it's more like 250,000. But I mean, still a lot of people, not 2 million, 250,000 people on the street. It was a largely peaceful protest, which was reported worldwide, which forced the Hong Kong government to back down, to withdraw to suspend, to suspend the extradition treaty bill. But right after that, the protest did not stop. It escalated, and the day after the Hong Kong government announced that it was going to withdraw the bill, a group of Hong Kong protesters, they're not the majority, a minority group of the Hong Kong, more radical group of Hong Kong protesters, they went to the Hong Kong Legislative Council building. They stormed in, and they broke through. They trashed the place. They occupied the place, and then they tore down the Hong Kong flag from the legislative council hall and replaced it with a colonial Hong Kong flag with Union Jack on it, right? And
Yeah.
yes, and then at that point, there are some people trying to make excuse. Oh, that must be like a false flag operation. Like the China probably infiltrated the protests. Some Chinese infiltrator probably did this to make the protest look bad. And then some of the the Hong Kong protest leaders, they posted on Instagram, the social media of themselves, of their selfies inside the legislative council building, flashing peace signs, say, yeah, we did it, we took over the building. And we took all the videos and images of them trashing the place. Many of them are now, they fled to Taiwan afterwards, seeking asylum in Taiwan.
That's ironic too.
Yes. and
Oh.
and but I
So
want
what
to
you're
point.
saying is that it's organic now, right? It's not actually, it wasn't actually uh it wasn't a provocateur.
Yeah. I mean, it's what they call. There's a narrative in the media calling it the leaderless movement, right?
Yes.
So
Then Occupy was like that too, right?
yeah. But there's still forces, there's still people meddling behind the scenes, right?
Yeah.
The leaderless is fine, but there's still people trying to influence the events. And I would like to point out to an article that appeared on New York Times called "The Hong Kong Protesters' Tactic: Get the Police to Hit You." It was written by a Hong Kong protester, and it laid out their tactic. Basically, he proposed what they practice, what's called the marginal violence theory. Uh, he said the Hong Kong protesters should take up what he called aggressive, non-violent protest, but escalate to the point where the police will be forced to respond with overwhelming force. And once they can make the police overreact, they can win 1 million people to their side. That was literally what was written in New York Times. And that was written in late June. And so far, the Hong Kong protests play exactly by that rule book. And not always non-violently either, because there was a lot of there's a lot of journalists, a lot of cameras in Hong Kong, focus on Hong Kong right now. The protesters would do is they would do called aggressive non-violence. They will go confront the police. They will throw projectile at the police. They will do things like storming the legislative council, do everything to get the police to fire tear gas at them. And then, everything will be caught on camera. The aftermath, the part of the police violence. I'm not defending the police brutality here, but all the police overreaction caught on video, those are what's being shown across the world media right now.
Yeah, of course.
They're not showing what happened before that, just before the tear gas. And like there's a lot of screwed up things we're doing. They were harassing. So there was a general strike a couple of days ago. The protest. I mean, the idea of general strike is to get workers to join you, to everybody to go on strike. But what general strike in Hong Kong's case was these protesters, mostly students on summer vacation from school, they set up roadblocks in the busy Hong Kong streets, and in some cases, when some drivers try to bypass the roadblocks, those cars get stopped, and there's videos on Twitter of people getting dragged out of their van and beaten just because they didn't stop in time, or they didn't want to stop, and now there's like there's just like those are things that are not really being reported. That's what
another thing I saw, I guess it was a famous video in the airport where
yes,
I saw someone explain. I'm not sure if it was you, Carl, if it was someone else, but you have the very physically superior protesters doing things. The police react, but they get the weaker protesters.
Yes,
the stronger ones run away.
Yes,
and the police will grab one of the stragglers, if you will.
Yes.
And and brutalize them, but you never see what happened to the ones who are the shock troop type protesters. I don't want to actually, that's a bad comparison, but the stronger, faster ones.
Exactly we're describing. And I think in one way, in some certain ways, the Hong Kong police is not equipped or trained to handle such large-scale protests, because Hong Kong hasn't faced this kind of political unrest since the last time was 2014, but really this kind of violence Hong Kong hasn't seen since the 1967 protest. That was the protest that the British had to call out the Royal Marines to patrol streets of Hong Kong with bayonets. And this time, though, because there are just so many people on the streets, the Hong Kong police, there are overwhelmed, they're undernumbered, and they always, like that part in that particular video, the police charge into the airport, and then the all the more agile
Yeah.
able protester ran away. And so the police just tackled the closest person to him. It happened to be a woman who looked just harmless, right? And
Yeah.
while the police wrestled the woman to the ground, have his back turned, then the then he got zerg rushed by all the other protesters surrounding by. They actually gang up on the police and tore his baton from his hand and start beating the police with his own baton. And at that point, the police officer drew his gun, right?
Yeah.
And like I think one of the Western journalists tweeted that video. He said, "Well, you're just so lucky no one got shot, right?" So I give him credit for not shooting anyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pulling his gun, but what happened before, it does show, like, Hong Kong police was not. It's not. It does not have the capability, it looks like, to handle this type of unrest, right? And what they do is they just generate these footages for the media, which loves this kind of stuff. And
Oh yeah, that one went viral.
yeah, yep. And then there was something else happened to the airport 2 days ago on Tuesday. So the protester went to the airport to have sit-in. They did it this several days. Initially, they were just there to protest, to show travelers were still going through. But most recently, they have decided to basically escalate, right? They want to escalate until government respond to their demands. So now their demand is the government publicly withdraw the extradition treaty. The governor, Carrie Lam, resign. Universal suffrage, right? And so basically they make all these demands that right now the Hong Kong government, for whatever reason, facing measures, do not want to admit to defeat, and then they would just escalate until they get government's attention. And first they try to do the disrupt the train service. You talk about the very convenient metro system in Hong Kong. I was just in Hong Kong in July. That's when they already stormed the Legislative Council. But as a tourist, most of the tourist area was not affected. I was able to get out from the airport to Hong Kong Island, to Kuala Lumpur Peninsula, to enjoy the lovely city. But just last week, they did this disruption campaign basically to stop all the commuter trains, right? And you have the videos of these protesters blocking the trains from leaving, and very frustrated passengers trying to get to work. And then with the airport, they then move on the protest to the airport. Because one of the rationale is, okay, the police is not going to throw tear gas at the airport. And what they did was that initially it was just they just like show of force, and then they moved to a point where they're blocking departure gate. They're preventing passengers from reaching departure gate. And you saw videos on Twitter of all these very frustrated passengers trying to go home. And so there's a couple of things happened. One, 2 days on Monday, the authorities grounded all flights from Hong Kong, right? Or is it all flights, or they cancel some of the flights? And then,
if I could just interrupt you for a second,
sure.
I only remember there being one big airport, and the metro system.
Yes.
I mean, the city can't function without it. It's
yes.
I mean, you can take a taxi here and there, but you have to use that train. I mean,
yes.
The city's going to be crippled without that
yes.
airport and that train. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that was the point. I mean, like when I question the protester tactic on Twitter, people say, well, that is the point. That is the point of is disruption. But I'm like, isn't the point is to get more people on your side? What you're doing is you're alienating these ordinary working people who are just trying to reach their jobs and reach their family. You are not really, you're not really winning them over by these tactics. But
yeah, that's always the balance that you're trying to
yeah,
disrupt but not turn the public against you. Yeah.
exactly. But um the scene got pretty ugly at the airport on Tuesday. So first they prevent all the passengers from reaching their planes, and even the even the Hong Kong swimming team. They're trying to board a flight to Singapore, and it's funny because the Hong Kong swimming team trying to explain to the protester, we support your cause, we support the protest, but please let us board our flight so we can represent Hong Kong. And they're like, no, you have to you have to understand, where this is a revolution. Why can't you make the same sacrifice as we do? But eventually they did let those swimming team through. But what we got ugly when they had a couple okay, I to be more balanced, I do have to give to there's some weird things happening beforehand. So there was the protester did attack by these white shirts in new territory. When they went to new territory in Yuanlong train station, they were set upon by these white shirt thugs who many believe have the triad background, and many think police were in cahoots with the triads to
the triads are the organized crime.
Yes.
Okay.
So there was a day when the protester went to new territory, they got beaten up at the train station by these white shirt thugs, and so that's another reason that kind of escalate the protest itself. They're protesting what they see as a police collusion with the triad plus the police brutality. And so
now we have sort of guerrilla protesters and guerrilla police.
Yes,
we're gonna fight all this covertly, sort of.
Yes. And then the day before, on Monday, they had this footage of basically plainclothes cops fighting with the protesters, right? And there was a famous video footage that was shared all around of this a young protester got his face smashed into the pavement by the riot police, right?
Oh.
And that was shared all over. But but I saw from the reporter of QZ.com, which is which is a very sympathetic journalist to the protest. He showed the full footage of what happened. According to her, that there were some police that were wearing civilian clothes, undercover police, starting a fight with the protesters. So the protesters starting to attack these undercover, those plainclothes cops. Well, the protester claimed they don't know they're undercover cops. The protester claimed they thought they were mafia, they were triads attacking them. So these group of protesters, they had this man down on the ground. They were beating him with sticks, right? But the next thing the riot police then arrived and they grabbed one of the guy who was beating the guy on the ground, who was turned out to be a plainclothes cop, and then they grabbed that guy and smashed his face to the pavement. Oops. So basically, the table got turned on the protester. But that video is not shown as shared as widely as just the video of him with a bloody face on the pavement, right? I mean, there's violence on both sides. There's violence from the protester and the police, right? I'm not defending the police violence here.
No, I mean, but as soon as there is violence, this is what happens.
Yes.
It gets out of control, and the most extreme elements are the ones who dominate, and that's when it all goes bad.
Yep. And you all went to hell yesterday. They arrested the protesters at the airport. They arrested a mainland Chinese traveler. They claim he is undercover cop. So they zip tied him, right? They tied him up.
I saw that, yeah.
Took his poured water on him, interrogated him, took his passport, took his ID, took his wallet, and they Google his name, and supposedly they found a match of found a name match with a police officer in mainland, right? And so they're like, look, see, he's a mainland police. So they beat him for hours at the airport. They held him for, according to the CNN reporter who was there, they held him for 4 to 5 hours, and the man collapsed twice. And during that time, the paramedics tried to reach the man, but the protester blocked the paramedics from reaching him. I mean, at the time, it was quite dangerous. Some of the reporters thought the man could die, and when the paramedics finally reached the man, the protester then blocked the paramedics from leaving the airport. They form a human wall, and that. So this whole time, on Tuesday, the entire day, the police did not show up at the airport, but after this man was held for 4 to 5 hours, this ordeal was broadcast live on live feed on many news organizations. In fact, my cousin in mainland China, he saw this live in China. I didn't ask him which news site he saw. I wonder about that. How did he saw the live feed? But one thing I do know is that CNN is actually not blocking China, so maybe he saw it on CNN. And because CNN runs a live feed of the live blog of the protest. But
and CNN is available in China, in mainland China?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I did not know that either until I went to China. But the fact is, the funny thing is, most Chinese people didn't know either because they don't bother go to CNN for their news anymore.
I guess not. Yeah.
Yeah, because CNN reputation in CNN acquired as much of fake news moniker in China as it is in the United States now.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I went to see. I was really surprised I was able to go to CNN, and I even tweeted about it. It was like, oh my God, China lifted the block on CNN. And some reporter told me, oh, come on, CNN has been available for years. I was like, really? How come nobody know about it?
Yeah.
And so certain websites are blocked, like NYT. NYT is blocked. After NYT was available until they reported on the previous Chinese leader Wen Jiabao's family wealth. They had a front page report on the like the $1 billion the former Chinese premier Wen Jiabao's family.
I remember that.
Yes. So after that New York. Their New York Times website got blocked in China.
Are there the same rules in Hong Kong as on the mainland, or can you get to anything in Hong Kong?
Hong Kong, there's no firewall in Hong Kong. You can Hong Kong is wide open.
Okay, so all the New York Times advice to the protesters, they're able to read all that.
Yep, everything. And so I mean, so finally, after like my cousin, mainland cousin, he was glued. He told me he was glued to his computer screen, just watching this guy getting tortured in the airport for 4 to 5 hours. And he told me he was very angry. He told me, he's like, I don't understand. How can, from his perspective, how can a Chinese person in the airport of his own country getting tied up, tortured, without any sort of protection? How could such thing happen, right? And that's a perspective of many mainland Chinese people. And like a lot of mainland Chinese people are very mad right now after that video came out. And many of them actually are calling for the Chinese government to send in the PLA to crush the rioters. Many of them are right now would support the PLA to move into Hong Kong. And which I gets to the reports of the people, the large-scale movement of the people's armed police into Shenzhen, the city next door. This was actually first reported in the Chinese state media. This happened. This happened on the day right after this ugly airport incident, right? And basically the Chinese state media, I think it was People's Daily, Global Times, Xinhua, and CGTN. they all had, these videos out, and in English says, oh, there's going to be a large scale exercise in Shenzhen across the border from Hong Kong. These troops these armed police stand ready, to defend stability against all all provocateurs.
And this is just to make sure I understand. This is in the English language
Yes.
Chinese media. So they want to send the message that, look, we've got all these troops. They're close by. Yes. So is it a warning? Is it a threat?
Yes. I mean, I think
because it seems like it'd be a PR disaster for.
It's a show of force, but I think it's also there's two purposes. One is show of force to say the Hong Kong protester, but more importantly, it's for domestic consumption, because right now all the mainland Chinese people who have watched the live feed of this fellow mainlanders got tied up and beaten. By the way, there were two mainland Chinese people. There were three mainland Chinese people that got detained at the airport by protesters. One was released early. One was this guy who was suspected to be a policeman who got held and beaten for 4 hours and beaten unconscious a couple of times. And then there was another guy who turned out to be reporter for the Chinese state media Global Times. And his video also went viral because just after he got tied up, the Hong Kong protesters searched his belongings and found a T-shirt, "I love Hong Kong police" T-shirt, right?
Oh.
and he told in front of the camera, he told the police protester, he said, "I love Hong Kong police. Now you can proceed to beat me." He said that in Chinese, and that clip went viral in the Chinese social media. And right now, like, all the mainland Chinese are basically calling for vengeance. They're calling for blood. They want the government to do something. So the central government have to be shown that they're doing something, right? They can't be shown like standing by while Hong Kong is descending into chaos. So one of this training exercise in Shenzhen is really, I think, even most important purpose was to show the domestic audience, oh, look, we have our armed police standing by. We are ready. We have the capability. Right?
Is it in their benefit to show the force but exercise restraint?
Yes, because I think more importantly was a press conference given out by Hong Kong Governor Carrie Lam the day before. At the time, there was I think Sky News journalist or one. They're asking her, oh, okay, what about, are you going to meet the Hong Kong protester demands? Can you confirm that the extradition bill will be withdrawn, right? Do you have the authority to do that, or do you need approval from Beijing? Like a lot of the pointed questions, but instead what she said was, Beijing government has expressed full confidence in me and the Hong Kong police to handle the situation in Hong Kong. Yeah, and that's all she said. And I think that, at least by the time of that press conference, that's a signal. She is saying there will be no immediate intervention by PLA, by the Chinese central government. They will leave the discretion to her and the Hong Kong police to handle the Hong Kong protest, at least in the immediate term, right?
That's what the ambassador said too. He said the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, so the huge mass of people's armed police across the border, I believe that's mostly like a PR stunt for the domestic audience consumption. And also keep in mind, China does not need to send military into Hong Kong. China has military in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I saw you mention that on Twitter, like 7,000 PLA or something.
Yes, there's PLA has been in Hong Kong since 1997 handover. I mean, right now in the PLA garrison in Hong Kong, there's 7,000 PLA soldiers, and they actually regularly conduct anti-riot operation drills. Like they even released a video which I posted from just a few months ago. Like when
I just saw that.
Yeah,
pretty kind of scary, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's meant to be. I mean, they released it on an official channel with English subtitles, and they even had the officers yelling out in Cantonese. It's like he said something basically, you will bear all responsibility. Then people, his soldiers were yelling, fall back, beating on their shields, and but on the loudspeaker he keep on saying, all you protesters, you will bear all responsibility.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I couldn't understand what they were saying. I was
Yeah.
just taking the visuals. But that's
Yeah.
what he was saying? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So right now there's a lot of moving pieces, right? I mean, like in China, it would be a PR disaster to send PLA into Hong Kong. And I think some people in the media, Western media, are kind of I feel they're almost kind of hoping this happens because there's like Twitter is going crazy today with all these footage of these army trucks and all these armed police gathering in Shenzhen, and everybody was freaking out. It's like, oh my god, it's going to be Tiananmen 2.0, Tiananmen 2.0, right? But what they don't understand is Tiananmen 30 years. I was in China in 1989 when Tiananmen Square protests happened. At that time, Tiananmen Square protest was a nationwide protest, and it happened in Beijing, the center of the political power. Right now, the Hong Kong protest is contained in Hong Kong. The fact that all these virulent anti-mainland Chinese nativism expressed by the Hong Kong protesters, that means very few mainland Chinese people actually support them. The protest contagion will not spread to mainland. I mean, if anything, the airport beating has united the mainland Chinese more than ever. And so the Chinese government is not facing a legitimacy crisis right now, like they potentially was during 1989. I mean, they could sit back and just watch Hong Kong burn. I mean, they probably prefer Hong Kong not burn, right? Because Hong Kong is still very important, serving as a financial conduit of like investment into China. But for a purpose of the maintaining of communist control on power, Hong Kong is irrelevant. Hong Kong is like what Hong Kong protests are doing in Hong Kong. They are disrupting Hong Kong. They're not disrupting China as a whole. That's a very important fact, because in 1993, when Chris Patten was trying to do his change the electoral laws of Hong Kong, back then Hong Kong's GDP was 27% of the entire Chinese GDP. It was almost a third. Almost a third of Chinese GDP is a Hong Kong GDP. Today, Hong Kong GDP is about 2.9% of Chinese GDP.
Wow.
That's
so
how.
here,
Go ahead.
and here we go again, where in the West we are basing our views, and I don't know, maybe even our plans on an outdated situation.
Yes.
I'm really not understanding the situation. And I had no idea that Hong Kong was as isolated and less important nation of China. I had no idea that that was the situation.
Well, I mean, Hong Kong is still important, but it's not as important as it used to be.
Right. I mean, it used to be
so
critical.
Important. Yes, it used to be so crucial. Now it's not crucial. It's still important, but not crucial. I mean, Hong Kong is still a very wealthy city compared to many of mainland Chinese cities. But right now, there's not that huge differential gap between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. I would say Shenzhen is probably a nicer city. I mean, because one of the reasons Shenzhen is newer, like in all the Chinese cities right now, all the infrastructures were just built a couple of years ago. They were brand spanking new. I was in Guangzhou. I was really impressed with their subway. It was air conditioned. It was clean. It has internet. I can ride Guangzhou subway for 1 hour without interruption for internet service because the train has internet and AC. And so like right now the life in China is getting pretty good, right? I mean, but even yeah, I mean, not just people
Yeah,
in the
like the
West.
thing is here, you're seeing hints of, and I don't know how widespread this is, but you're seeing hints of, well, once the Chinese people see what's going on in Hong Kong, it's going to spread.
No.
It's gonna
No.
they're gonna rise up too. And what the picture you're painting is entirely different than that. And it's
Yeah.
just we don't have an accurate. I mean, I don't expect to have an accurate view, right? If countries are adversaries, you
Yeah.
can't expect to get a an accurate
Yeah,
view.
I
But
mean, even me, I mean, I'm a Chinese American. I'm constantly extremely online, always plug into the Chinese social media scene. Even me, it was a shock when I traveled to China just 2 months ago. It was a big difference because I haven't been in China for um, 9 years since my last visit. My last visit was 2010, and this time I saw every time, every 9 years I go back to China, the whole place looked different.
that's the
And
thing too, Carl. I mean, it's just the rapid change, the just extremely rapid change.
yes,
It's shocking, and
yes,
I wonder. It's not surprising that there are going to be these different, that there'll be unrest, that there'll be
yes,
difficulty adjusting.
yes,
And the other thing I didn't realize is that there was a 50-year limit on the two
yes,
systems
yes.
situation. And now, we're coming up on 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and what is it, 20, is it
2047,
2047? That's not
2047.
that, that's not that long,
Yeah,
really.
28 years. 28 years before the one country two system officially become one country one system. And right, I mean, so Hong Kong people have, I mean, it's very understandable. They have this unease about their future,
Well,
right?
yeah, I mean, I kind of hope that the good parts, the things that are better for the people
Yeah,
would be adopted in China, the universal suffrage and so on. And I kind of don't understand why is it a governor? Is that what the, I'm sorry, I forgot her
oh, the
name
Chris
again.
Patton, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong.
No, the current
Oh,
leader,
Carrie Lam, Carrie Lam.
Carrie Lam. Yeah. Uh, I kind of don't understand why they don't just say, all right, we'll ditch the extradition treaty. That's not the only demand, but that would take a lot of air out of the protesters. It
Yeah,
seems like it would do it, but here, this is a cultural thing that I don't
yeah.
understand clearly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like she would lose face, right? I mean, like that was, I mean, they like suspending the bill was kind of a face-saving way of saying they're wrong. They misread the public opinion. I mean, she did apologize. She did apologize for misreading the public on the acceptance of the bill. But yeah, I mean, like I still think it was the bill itself is deader than dead, and I think really the extradition bill is only a trigger, right? That was a symptom.
Exactly.
That's not the underlying cause. The underlying cause is still the economic dislocation, the uncertainty about the future, the discontentment the Hong Kong youth feels about their diminished prospect, and then there's these combined with the misdirected nativism, right? And
Yeah.
it's like a very potential toxic mix, and
And
right now,
the rapid change. I mean,
yes, yes. I mean, I think Hong Kong. See, it's a lot easier to understand the Hong Kong youth because really a lot of what they're facing is what millennials are facing across much of the Western world right now.
yes, yes.
Um, and but it's insane in Hong Kong in a way because Hong Kong's future, both its economic future, lays with further integration with mainland China. The reason Hong Kong became what it was, sure, it's separate status, but also because it was windowed to China for all those years. And right now its decline is also because its status as window to China was it's not the sole window to China anymore. Now it has to compete with all these other Chinese cities, and um, but Hong Kongers are kind of clinging on to these like their special kind of privilege they enjoy in the past, and that past is not returning because the Chinese mainland is moving forward. Like some of the stuff they do, it just doesn't make sense to me because there so much anti-mainland. They were against high-speed rail line extending to Hong Kong. I'm like, how? I mean, that just because their rationale is that the high-speed rail line is just going to bring more mainlanders into Hong Kong. But like, how can you just be against more tourists to bring tourist dollar to your economy? I mean, like, it's mind-boggling to me. And to me, as an outsider, I think it's obvious that Hong Kong's economic future lays with further integration with mainland. I can understand their concern, anxiety about their political future, right, which is a separate question. But right now, it's like a total rejection of everything mainland Chinese. It's crazy, and it manifests itself in the airport beating, and my mainland cousin, my other mainland cousin from my mother's side, she was actually planning to go to Hong Kong this August with her small daughter. And I was so concerned because I went to Hong Kong in early July. Everything looked peachy, and so when she asked me if there was any safety concerns because of protests, I'm like, no, you don't even feel the protest on the tourist areas. And then
last
week,
that changed.
Everything went to hell with the airport blockage. So I immediately called her up, and luckily she was smart enough to cancel her flight, and she was actually originally her flight was scheduled to fly out on Tuesday, the ugliest night at the airport. I was like, oh, thank God. Thank God, it's the right decision. Oh, Jesus. Yeah.
Well, you've thank you so much for giving us this multifaceted view of all the different factors, because we're just not getting that, and I really appreciate it. I don't take any sides here, but I do worry about the kids who are protesters, what you mentioned, that it seems like, I don't know, whatever force it is, but they're almost hoping for a Chinese military intervention. And I wonder if those kids like really understand what they got into.
Yeah, I don't know if the kids who are out in the front is really wanting the Chinese military intervention. I think there's some other forces that might want Chinese military intervention, because I was in China during 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, and I remember how it went down. Nobody expected the crackdown as it happened, right? And then most the Chinese student protesters in '89, they were very naive. They were very idealistic youth, who believe in socialism. They believe in democracy. They believe the system could be improved, could be reformed. But in the end, it got very radicalized, and there was I would highly recommend for people who are interested in Tiananmen Square incident to watch this documentary called "The Gate of the Heavenly Peace" by American documentary maker. I think what's her name? Isabel Hilton. It's on YouTube, so you can watch all of it. It's called "The Gate of the Heavenly Peace," and it's about 3-hour documentary. Covered the Tiananmen protest from the beginning to end. And there was a part where they interview one of the student leader, Cai Lin, who was just before the deadly night of crackdown. She was talking to this American reporter in a hotel room, and she said, we must have blood on the streets. She says, our fellow students don't understand, but the only way to wake up people is to have blood. To have the government to spill blood. Only then will the people realize the true nature of the state, right? But she's not telling her students. She's not telling the students who look up to her as a leader. But that was her plan to force the the bloodshed, and she didn't come out very well in that documentary. It's highly recommended. So I feel like most people who are joining the protest, right, most of the young people, they are, they're just expressing their discontent. They're demanding their political rights, but it seems to me they're not very clear about what their end goal is. And what happened then is they end up being basically pawns in some power struggle behind the scenes by other forces, right? I mean, like we already seen the US consulate political officer Julie, what's her last? I can't pronounce her last name. Judy Yidu meeting with student leader Joshua Wong in the JW Marriott Hotel in Hong Kong. That photo went viral on Chinese social media. I do think the Hong Kong protesters have their own legitimate grievances. They're legitimate. They have legitimate discontent. I feel the nativism aspect was misdirected. They do have legitimate right to have peaceful demonstration to demanding universal suffrage, but the ways it's shaping up, it's just so many people are trying to dip their hands into the pie, and
yes,
and this type of movement can easily be manipulated and co-opted and subverted, and we've seen that in Syria, we've seen that in Ukraine. And right now, I just want to lay it out there. Even though Chinese government bears certain responsibility for this, one is the introduction of the bill. Two is they basically maintain the whole British colonial structure intact. Nothing changed, which like did not benefit most of the people in Hong Kong. Definitely not the youth, right? But having said that, the Chinese government do not want to see instability in Hong Kong. So what they want to see is status quo, everything going on as before, even if us have the oligarchy running the place. They just want business as usual. So you have to think about who exactly benefits from Hong Kong that's been destabilized. Right. I mean, and those are things that's fair to think about. And I don't think I can understand why the protesters themselves, they may not be thinking about those things, because you get caught up in the moment. I was in China in 1989. I was a 13-year-old. Even though I went to some of the street protests, it's a very infectious environment when you are in that kind of like a revolutionary atmosphere. You just get caught up in it. Humans are not rational animals, right? We're very emotional. We respond to like this kind of mass psychology especially when you feel like you are on the right? You are
when you're in it, you definitely get caught up in. I've been there myself, so yeah, I get it.
Yeah, and I really do hope like this can be resolved peacefully, without further violence and escalation. But we can only hope.
Right, I agree. And again, Carl, thanks so much for this perspective. I learned a lot. I kept you a lot longer than when we planned, but I think it was worth it. And
yes.
But do tell people where they can find your work and how they can support you, please.
Yes. You can just Google my name, Carl Za. Carl is spelled with a C, so Carl, and my last name Zha. Z is spelled Z like zebra, H like Henry, A like apple. Just 3 letters, Zha. Carl Za. If you Google Carl Za, you will see my Twitter account, and you will also see my Twitter handle is literally just Carl Za, and you can also see my 2 of my podcasts. So one is my latest podcast, The Silk and Steel Podcast, which is on Patreon. You can also find it on Patreon or just find it on Google. It will be either the first or the second link show up when you search my name, or you can just search for The Silk and Steel Podcast. You will be the first one to show up. I have an older podcast called Clash, which working on at the moment, but I made all the archive episodes of Clash. I think there were like 30 of them, all publicly free available, so people can listen to them. I talk about a lot about China, and as well as like current events and history. I'm a big history geek. And please support me on Patreon, because right now I am trying to make a living out on Bali. That is my major income source right now. So I would really appreciate it if people can support me on Patreon. So, and thank you very much, Joanne, for this opportunity to come to your show to talk about this issue of Hong Kong and China, which I feel very passionate about.
Thank you so much, Carl. I really appreciate it. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Definitely. Talk to you later.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Carl Za. Follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Za, CarlZha. Subscribe to his podcast, Silk and Steel, at Patreon. And listen to his previous podcast, Clash. Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is really important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or do one-time donations via PayPal, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find all these links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. The syndicated audio podcast, Around the Empire, can be found in many places. You can find it on any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And hey, if you're listening on YouTube, hit the thumbs up icon to like the videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Leave me some comments, send me feedback. That's really great. I love it when people do that. Also, follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.